Okay, it being 6:30, I'll call the meeting of the Oregon School District Board of Education to order. It's Monday, September 10th. We're at the Oregon School District Innovation Center at the high school. Would you call the roll, Katie?
Ms. Feeney?
Present.
Ms. Oderico?
Here.
Ms. Flanagan? Mr. Pankratz?
Here.
Mr. Kraus?
Nope.
Mr. LeBrun? Mr. Zach?
Present. And I had been informed by Tim and Krista that both were going to be out of town on business today, so they gave me advance notice of that. Do you have the proof of notice? I've got proof that the meeting was appropriately noticed under Wisconsin Open Meetings Law. The agenda tonight contains several action items. One is preliminary approval of our budget, the annual meeting agenda, and our teacher comp and educator comp contracts and supplemental compensation, and then a report on professional development pathways from Leslie, right? Okay, and the referendum update. Then we're going to be going into closed session to talk about land acquisition related to the referendum, and we're not going to be coming out of closed session after that session. I would need a motion to approve the agenda as posted.
Also
Ms. Feeney with a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Oderico with a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That motion carries. Consent calendar A. Any board member wish to remove anything from the consent calendar? Okay, seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the consent items on the consent calendar.
I move to approve the consent calendar.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Pankratz. We don't have any contracts, policies, or resignations, so we'll do a voice vote. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That motion carries. Items on the consent calendar are passed. I should note that we had two donations. One was a $10,000 contribution from the Oregon Athletic Boosters, which is their payment 3 of 5 related to J.C. Park. Very generous from them. And then the Women of St. John's donated $300 for school supplies and clothing for students of our district. Thank you very much for those contributions to our district. Moving on to communications from the public, under Board Policy 180.04, the board is afforded an opportunity to address the board. Is there anyone registered with you, Ms. Heitz? Anyone in the audience? Once, twice, 3 times? We'll move on to informational items, OEA report. Nate? Nothing tonight, right? We talked. We do have an item on the agenda for your interest later on. Student report, and I don't see Emily tonight.
She's okay with me sharing. She's in a car accident this morning. She's fine.
Okay, that's great. Tell her we wish her the best, and I still have to reach out to her to have coffee, so I got busy the last week, so great. Action items, September 24th, 2018 budget. In 2 weeks, we have a statutory prescribed annual meeting of the electors of the Oregon School District, which involves a budget hearing and an annual meeting where the tax levy is adopted. You have in your packet a proposed agenda that tracks with the agenda that we've had in the past for this meeting, but we would need a motion to approve that agenda.
Also move.
Ms. Feeney with the motion to approve the agenda for the annual meeting. Is there a second? I know it's so exciting.
Well, I'll second it. I was not going to because I'm not going to be in attendance.
That's okay.
But I'm happy to second the motion.
Ms. Oderico with a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We have an agenda for our annual meeting, and that will be published pursuant to state law. And that will be held in this room, correct? Yeah. Okay. That takes us to item D2, preliminary budget for 2018-2019. This is the first step in our final approval of the 2018-19 budget. The first step has to be published for the annual meeting so that we can adopt a tax levy. And then we'll get a crack at the final budget in October. But Andy, this is your bailiwick, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. As Steve just said, this is kind of the first step in the approval of the budget process, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The preliminary budget, as I'm presenting it to you tonight, you'll get another rendition of it in a 2 weeks from this evening at the annual meeting. I'll also add a little bit of information about how we financially did last year. So I'm going to focus tonight just real briefly, kind of at the 100,000 foot level on the preliminary budget, and try to talk about those things that are overlying the budget, not really dive into the details. And then, if you recall, we actually come back and look at the budget one more time. After the third Friday student counts are in, you're going to see how important that is to us during this presentation. And then we approve the original budget in October, as well as the tax levy. So, quick revenue projections that we used in building this budget. Enrollment is estimated. We were in the infield. We're back in March, April, May. We were in the ballpark. Now we're in the infield. So we've got it nailed down a little bit. We still don't have it completely nailed down because we're still counting kids, and that does take us a little while to kind of chase down students that we're not exactly sure where they are, and that takes a couple weeks, especially for our larger school, which is like the high school. We used a 0 per member increase for the state budget and the revenue limitation. That was okay though, because of something that I'm going to talk about here in the next, and we went from about $450 per member in our categorical aid to $654. So basically an increase of $204, which is kind of more in line with what we were used to about a decade ago as far as getting a $250 increase per student per year. Gets us more in the area of being able to kind of handle things in a way that we can. Basically, you're getting to about a 2% increase per year rather than a 0 increase.
Andy, just a question on
yeah.
that. And other board members, at a point in time where it makes sense to jump in and ask Andy about an item, do so. You don't ask for the chair's permission. The categorical aid, that's not necessarily going to be fixed then for the following biennial budget.
So what's interesting is, and I have to remember the number off the top of my head, I don't. They talk about that number actually being less in the next budget, but as you just said, that's the next biennial budget, and so it is into the future. We don't know, because it's not law right now, what that budget will be, but they did give us a hint that that number will actually decrease next year. Whether that could be just an accounting thing that they were trying to do, or if it was a signal to us, we're not exactly sure. But yeah, that is a categorical aid that has to be allocated each budget process.
I mean, and that is when we hear during the political campaigns about increasing the state budget, it wasn't the base, which is going to stay as the base. It's just the one-time biennial budget dollar allocation for categorical aid that could go down.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this year we're 18-19, that's a good number for us, but 19-20 we just have to watch
Yep.
what happens.
Yep. The biennial budget every 2 years increases the level of anxiety in my office. It's just part of the game, so to speak. So special education aid proration, that's a fairly large number to us. It's a little over 25%. Back when I started here 19 years ago now, it was in the 30s. So that's continued to go down. It's stabilized recently, so that's good. Basically, that means that any salary and benefit that we spend for special education purposes, we get about 25 cents on the dollar back the following year after we spend it, is basically what that accounts for. Our equalized value number is estimated at 5.8%. All that does is basically helps determine what our levy rate is. So we'll get into that in a second as well. So here again, we're kind of looking at our operating funds. We define that as 10 and 27, which are joined by the HIP because they have a transfer between them, and then Fund 38, which is also which is a debt levy, but it's a debt levy that's included within the the revenue limitation. So we kind of combine those all together. But you can see from this graph very easily, and I'll make that point again here in a second, that we're kind of a two-income family, if you would. We get 40% of our revenue from equalization aid and 41% from property taxes. So we are starting to tip a little bit toward more property taxes than equalization aid in that. Otherwise, the other aids are fairly minor. Per pupil aid, again, that's a state thing that we just talked about. That's $654. That's another 5%. So, and if you add those equalization aid and per pupil aid, we're still a little bit more funded from state than we are property taxes. Major revenues, this is what I just mentioned. 81% of our district revenues come from property tax, equalization aid, which is derived from the revenue limit, which is the main component of what determines our spending authority on a year-to-year basis. This last year, based on an increase of what we're estimating right now is 80 FTE. That's down a little bit based on what our preliminary projections were, but again, we're trying to triangulate, and based on the information we have right now, we think 80 is a pretty good number. We're looking at 80 for an increase. We have a 3-year average in our revenue limitation formula, so that means our average increase over those 3 years is 59. So you can see that we're actually growing a little bit faster than we were in the past. 59 times our revenue limit, which is $10,880, $642,000. The per pupil aid increase of $204 that I mentioned before, that translates into approximately $800,000. You'll see that in the next slide. And then open enrollment increases, we based on $324 increase for regular education and $224 for special ed. Those are different allocations per open enrollment student. And that works for both the students coming in as well as the students going out.
Andy, what was our estimate for full-time enrollment?
Off the top of my head, we're somewhere in that 4,000 to 4,100 students, somewhere in that range.
Did we estimate that we'd have about 80 more students
We're,
this year?
we're actually estimating slightly higher than that, and we've kind of lowered that based on what we are seeing based on registration and those types of things.
Yeah, in our staffing plan, we had utilized 61 as the FTE increase.
That was probably the 3-year average.
That was a 3-year average
Right.
FTE, 61, and we're at 59 based on the numbers. So
We're not far off.
no, it just jumps. It just decreases the revenue down by like $15,000-$16,000. So it's pretty close in terms of our staffing estimate.
Yep. So new revenues, if we add up kind of everything that we have that we're anticipating here for this year, we're looking at about $1.5 million in new revenue sources coming from the revenue limit, which is based only on growth because that number number per student wasn't increased at all. Per pupil aid, that's what we were talking about before, that $654 that could be adjusted as next budget. And then open enrollment, we do still anticipate a little bit of increase in open enrollment revenue. Expenditure assumptions. This is based on our Board of Education approved staffing plan that we talked about last spring. Departmental allocations are basically frozen. There are some exceptions. We look at transportation, we looked at district insurances, liability, workers' comp, those types of things, and we adjust things based on what they are. Workers' comp, just FYI, very proud of this. Gina gets credit too. We're at a 0.7 mod. If you know what that means in insurance, that means we're 30% below all our comparables as far as workers' compensation. So that's a really good number. Can't promise that we'll be able to hold it there forever, but because lightning does strike, unfortunately, and things do happen to people. But right now we're doing really, really well in that area. Building budget tier allocations were also held constant, so that's the allocation that we give each building based on per students. Those dollar amounts have been frozen for some time, and we did continue to hold those levels. So building budget may change based on their enrollment, but it won't change per student. And then this does not include referendum expenses. So what that means is twofold. If a referendum is passed, that means that we'll have to adjust the budget, obviously, to deal with those things. But it also means, as we've talked about in the past, that we are incurring some expenses because of the need to build fairly quickly. We passed a reimbursement resolution several months ago so that we can be reimbursed for those dollars, but we don't have those in the budget right now. And quite honestly, it's a little bit of an internal debate between Mr. Ms. Newton and myself as to whether we want to include those and kind of muck up everything, because we don't know if we'll have the revenue or not based on if the referendum passes. Those expenses would then move to a different fund, compared to if the referendum doesn't pass, we'll still have those costs and we'll have to budget for those. So we're kind of debating that internally, but for this purposes, we decided to keep those out. Expenditures by purpose, you got a feel for where we put our money. You can see that instruction eats up 60%, but instructional support, counselors, librarians, those types of things, health services, those are an additional 11%. So we're in the 70% range as far as instructional components. Administrative support is 9%, maintenance and operations 10%, transportation's 4%, and then we go down from there. Okay, how do you look at those expenditures, kind of chop them up a little bit differently? Where do we spend our money? Again, is another question. Salaries and benefits eats up over 75%. Purchase services includes things like utilities, transportation, which is a couple $1 million. That makes up the other 15%. And so at that point in time, you're at close to 90%. You can see everything else makes up a fairly small percentage.
So, Andy,
Yeah.
purchase services, that's contractors and
Yep.
not employees.
Correct. So it also include, for instance, evening cleaning services that we have in our buildings. Yep. So just doing a little reconciliation here. This is actually a slide that probably doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense by itself, but I'll try to walk you through it. Operating revenue for this year proposed at $51.5 million. Our expenditure budget is a little bit bigger than that, and that's because the difference is basically our carryover dollars. So if you took carryover out of the budget equation, we would be balanced. But if we have had a long-standing tradition here in Oregon that we carry funds over. Now, a good portion of this, almost $800,000, is related to the Teachers' Compensation Committee initiative, and we are using some of those funds this year for our experienced staff if you approve it this evening, to pay them an allocation, a one-time allocation that perhaps will continue, but that's the funds that we're using for that purpose. So the rest of it, about a little over $1 million, is related to other things that I'll talk about in a second. So the carryover is $1.985 million. Non-referendum debt, remember we talked about operating funds, and so the third fund is actually our referendum debt. And that fund is actually decreasing in expenses a little bit, so that's how we get to the $1.991 million. I'm sorry, it's actually increasing, not decreasing. So then we go to referendum debt, and this I wanted to make a point of. You can see that anticipation of the referendum that the constituents will be considering this year. We did have a budgeted decrease of around $400,000, a little over $400,000 in debt payments. In this budget, I'm actually showing that level so that we can make sure that as we publicize the difference, the increase in taxes to people, we show that that amount of money continues. So even though there's a decrease in here, the budget that we're going to look at in 2 weeks, a little bit more detail, anticipates that being the same. And we may put another page in there that would show what would happen if the referendum is approved. If you recall, when we've done this before in November, we typically approve kind of a contingent budget as well as a regular budget, so that if the referendum is approved, we don't have to come back and approve a separate budget. The intent here is that we would be levying 2 levies for debt service, one if the referendum is approved and one if it isn't.
And so, Andy, the slide you have is if, assuming the referendum does not get approved,
Right.
we have that cliff of about 400, and in the same token, if the referendum is approved, we have the first 400 in additional expenses.
Exactly.
Is taken care of by the cliff that we built in.
Correct. Absolutely.
which goes to offset, the cost above and beyond current levels.
Yep. And the reason I wanted to show you this is the numbers in the end are pretty good. So I wanted you to understand that we actually built this in. We built in a consistent $4.3 million for debt service. And I think you'll be fairly happy based on where we are at the end of this as far as the tax levy. So I wanted to show you that it is included, but I'm basically telling you that gap is included in this projection. Food service is a fairly minor fund. Wanted to just touch on it. We did have a fund balance decrease last year, but over $105,000, and it wasn't that much of a decrease. Over $105,000 was spent on capital equipment. We did a significant amount of capital replacement this last year, so we're in good shape. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the annual meeting. We did increase 5 cents for our food service prices, and we are trying to budget basically revenue equals expenses for this next year as well. Capital Projects Fund, we're still, believe it or not, spending money. We have a lot of closeout items and retainage that we have with contractors. We're trying to spend that as fast as possible, but we still at the July 1st had almost $700,000 left in 2014 projects. That will be done. I'm hopefully by January 1st at the latest. Employee trust funds, we are budgeting a little bit of a decrease this year for our employee balances for sick leave, having less people being assigned that choice to them. More our sick leave balances, more people have been selecting, or we have been selecting on their behalf, increases or a 403B investment policy for them for their sick leave conversion, and then our OPEB fund balance has to go up each year until we fully fund that, and we're still a little bit short of that by about $3 million. So we do budget an increase of $168,000 in that fund balance. If we don't have that increase, then we can't basically get special education categorical funding on OPEB contributions, so it's important that we continue to increase that until we're at a point where we're fully funded for our OPEB obligations.
Andy, that OPEB funding, is that the minimum, the 5%? Is that the minimum amount budgeted?
It is a minimum if you want to be able to count the categorical aid component. Yes, you can put more in there, and in the past we have.
Okay, but the budget is just
predicated on the 168, which is probably a little bit more than the 5%. Not a lot, but a little bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Community Education Fund. This is kind of broken into 4 areas internally. When the Department of Public Instruction looks at it, they don't really break that out, which is the same as the last fund. We break those things out for our own purposes. Community pool operations, you see it about $250,000. Performing Arts Center is just a portion of the salary of the PAC director. Community Education and Outreach, and this is kind of our programming budget that you see when we put the catalog out. And then the community building use. We do currently hire a security firm that basically looks at our buildings in the evenings on the weekends. So planned expenditures about $721,000. So then we get to a tax levy calculation. Again, this is a very high level, and we add all the different things. The operational is those 3 budgets that I talked about before: non-referendum debt, referendum approved debt, community services, as well as prior year levy chargeback is not a big thing. It's basically when communities don't have a taxpayer who's paid their bill, we have to refund the local taxpaying group, and then we're able to recoup those funds amongst the rest of the taxpayers. So very small amount, but that's how we get to the $26,122,171. Equalized value growth, I think this is still a little bit on the conservative side. I wouldn't be surprised if we hit 6%, but if you know me, I like to be conservative. So we're at 5.8% right now, at about a 10.9 mill rate. So that's a reduction of around 60 cents, 50 cents, 54 cents.
Andy, a question about that. When we were working with the referendum on the cost of our bond structure, the assumption for 18-19 that was used was 4%.
That's correct.
So if we're at a 5.8, the economic impact of the borrowing was going to be lesser than what we are utilizing right now in terms of public figures, right?
I think that would be accurate. We used that for both 2018 and 2019. So, and then I think we went down in 2020, 2021 a little bit.
Could we get a sense, could you do some ciphering, and not now, but in the next day or two, to if we were going to rerun the numbers on the amortization of the bonds and the costs of the interest over a period of time using 4%. If we could plug in 5.8,
Sure.
what that would do in terms of the cost of the referendum to taxpayers on the mill rate.
Sure, that would change the mill rate essentially. That's
Yeah, it
very
would
easy to do.
drive it down.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So then you can, here's just a historical kind of some graphs, what's going on with basically the equalized value per in the district. And you can see that we were kind of down a little bit. Equalization aid has been very steady. Operating taxes have been fairly steady as well. But the equalized value, after going down slightly for a number of years, is on a pretty steady increase. And you see that with growth in the district. You also see then on the bottom what's kind of happened with the levy rate, which does have an impact kind of with the equalized value and the state aid, if you kind of look at those and transpose them a little bit. So our all revenue budget funds, so if you added up all the funds that we're planning on spending this next year and all the different funds that we have, we're looking at just under $60 million. Our expenditure budget is a little bit bigger than that. Again, we budget for all the carryover funds to be used. Probably won't happen, but that's the intent, is in order to use them, they have to be in the budget. So you do see a $62 million allocation there. So there is a difference of over $2 million expenses and revenues, but it's in one-time funding, and the buildings and the people that have carryover understand that. So here's my favorite sheet. I've been saying that for probably 15 years, but it gives you, it gives you a one sheet kind of a look at what's going on with all the different funds in the budget from a very high level. Fund 10 is our main operation fund, and you can see that have we basically spend all our carryover dollars, we would be about $2 million less in fund balance than we are this year. So that's just around $11 million at the end of the year. That will not happen. I guarantee you that at this point in time. But hopefully carryover starts to get used. I know in some cases buildings have plans for that. I know the high school had some bills that came in right after July 1st, and the carryover allows them to have that happen, and then the funds get spent very quickly in July that they had hoped to have happen in June. So those types of things do happen, and the timing doesn't hurt us because we allow the carryover. Donation and gifts, that's just a guess. You can see last year I think we budgeted about $750,000. We came in at $650,000. I'm sorry, that's not right. $650,000 was the fund balance that we had in donations and gifts. We have $750,000 in expenses budgeted and revenues. That's really a little bit of obviously a crystal ball type thing based on what happens within those funds each year. Included in that is our activity funds. So those things like tournament account for athletics, those things that don't have student treasurers, any type of club or anything like that doesn't have an active student treasurer, we include in the gifts and donations funds based on DPI's guidance a few years ago, probably over a decade now. Non-referendum debt, that's Fund 38. That is debt that we've issued. It's mainly for two purposes. One was for the roofs at the middle school. I think we'll have those paid off this next year. And then there was also a payment for JC Park East. And so you can see in the end we'll only have about $45,000 left in that fund, and we're real close to basically having both of those paid off. Except there is one third thing I forgot, and that's our WRS unfunded liability. We will be paying that for a few years left, so there is a little bit more expense coming in for that.
Andy, a few years ago we borrowed $600,000 for technology upgrades. Is that part of that non-referendum debt?
I believe that is close to paid off, if not paid off, but I can double check on that. But you're right, that was part of that. Let's see here. Debt service, that's our referendum debt service. Again, you start with a balance. You see that we're going to be making our payments. And our revenues right now are slightly larger than our expenditures because, again, we're filling in that gap that I talked about. Once we have a referendum approved, if the referendum is approved, then those numbers will be adjusted. Referendum bonds, those are our proceeds from our bonds, and that's what I was talking about. Hopefully we'll have those spent by January or so. Food service fund, you see it budgeted balanced for the year. Trust funds, those are the OPEB funds and the employee trust funds that we have, those combined. And you see what's going on there. We, at the end of the year, still will have a little bit larger, the $168,000 more. We anticipate that it would be a balance at the end of the year. Community funds, those are those funds that we talked about this last year. By definition, those community education funds have to have a zero balance. So that's why we had a little bit of a carryover this last year. Our intent this next year is to spend more than we're bringing in so we can get back to that zero balance that we're supposed to have. Cooperative purchases is as a grant fund. We are the grant administrative agent for Carl Perkins, which is kind of a vocational technology grant component. And so that's just kind of a pass-through. We do that for a couple different districts and ourselves. So that is a quick rundown of the packet information that you have. There is obviously more information in the packet. If there's questions, I'd be happy to answer those as best I can. You see some spreadsheets from the Department of Public Instruction. And then the end of this packet is the if this agenda item is approved this evening, is basically the format that will go in, and it's required to go into the Oregon Observer in preparation for the annual meeting.
I'm going to start with Barb. Any questions on the preliminary budget for Andy? Courtney? Troy?
Just a question on the pool fund. I'm not recalling what page that was on, but just generally noticing the pool operates at a loss. Could you explain that?
So remember how I said the pool fund is one of four funds in the community education fund, and so community ed a couple years ago, there were significant balances that had accumulated in community ed funds in all districts in Wisconsin, and so the state basically came back and said you can't have a balance in there. So if you have a balance, you have to under levy the next year in order to anticipate a zero budget. So we didn't spend as much last year, so we had a balance. So basically the state says, okay, you can't levy that balance. You have to basically show a loss this particular year so that you have a zero balance at the end of the next year. It won't be zero, but the intent is to get closer to zero. And it could go negative even, and we'd have to borrow the funds a little bit from a different fund. But the idea is to try to target that zero each year.
Okay, so year to year.
Year to year it fluctuates. You are correct. I will tell you that, I mean, the pool does not, because sometimes we run into this perception from people, the pool wouldn't exist without taxpayer subsidy, basically, for it. We don't charge enough money, and nor could we, quite honestly, in order to make that work. A pool is a pool, and it costs money for us to operate that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Yep.
Dan?
Thanks. Andy, regarding the $1.9 million,
Carryover?
and yeah, I'm looking at your worksheet that came out in the packet,
Okay.
and it breaks down different parts. $767,000 of that is attributed to the new teacher compensation system.
Yep.
Does that include the new positions that we've approved, et cetera, or is that $767,000 separate from extra amounts that we may be paying for extra full-time equivalent teachers this year from last year?
So the way we've looked at it is it is separate from that, in that those allocations that we approved for additional positions need to continue. So it would not be a good idea, in my opinion, to use those one-time funds, those fund balance funds, to continue to pay for positions that continue into the future. So the idea with those one-time funds is to use them for one-time purposes as much as possible. So that's where we are using that this year, and probably for several years in the future, because they'll last a long time, to pay for people who are, in this case, off schedule, off of our employee compensation schedule. So the intent is to take those people who were off schedule right from the get-go, and they're a segmented group of people who have a fair amount of experience, and continue to use those one-time funds to kind of compensate them over time into the future, if that makes sense.
So is this $767,000 what we expect to spend this year?
No.
Less.
No, I wanted to show that it's reserved. I guess that would be another thing, is we wouldn't have to budget the whole thing. We're probably going to spend with Benny's $40,000 or so on those folks. So that's where I'm saying that $760,000 could take us a while.
So we're expecting for most of that to roll into the next year.
Correct.
And then the next year. Okay,
Correct.
Got it. Thanks.
Anything else, Dan?
Nope.
Okay.
I have one question.
Courtney, yeah.
Andy, going back to the equalized value, is that averaged over all municipalities? How do they
Yeah.
arrive at that
Yeah, well,
number?
so it's the Department of Revenue basically looks at the municipalities, and they look at sales data of homes and businesses, and tries to anticipate, tries to equalize, hence the word, if everybody was taxing at kind of the same level, what would be. Obviously, if you have assessment practices where we're only assessing every 3 or 4 years, their assessment practices could be way low and they could be underassessed. So then the Department of Revenue says, hey, if your home's assessed at $200,000, but all your neighbors are selling their $200,000 homes at $300,000, well, we're going to take that $1 million in assessed value and increase it by 33%, because that's what the sales value tells us, so that you're treated similar to another taxing body, which is doing the assessments every year. So that's very, very simply how they're doing it. It's probably significantly more detailed, but that's my understanding of it. So to go back to your first question, though, is each taxing body's impact, or what's going on with their assessment practices, will change. There is one municipality that actually had a reduction in assessed value, equalized assessed value in our district, and I'm trying to remember what it is, Montrose or something like that, compared to everybody else. Some of them had 9 or 8%, a lot of them had 6%. So they're kind of all over the board as to what's going on in each municipality. Fitchburg and Oregon are growing, so their assessments are increasing. And then you can even drill into that a little bit more, and some of that assessment increase is based on new construction, and some of it's based on just assessed values going up based on the sales data and the market value of the homes. So one of the reasons why I think the PMA was trying to be very conservative with that 4% was that they were not wanting to go as high, because one taxing body might not increase their assessed value by 4%.
Andy, with respect to the mill rate in the September 10th memo to us, it's listed at 10.7 in the...
Oh, no, we didn't change it?
Yeah, in the booklet it's 10.9. I'm assuming 10.7 is the right one or not?
10.9 is actually the right one. We
Okay.
apologize. We debated whether we wanted to include the level debt service. The
Okay.
difference, that $400,000 that we were talking about, that's the 20-cent difference.
Okay, so it's 10.9.
It is 10.9.
It's still really good.
It's down from last year, yes.
Well, it's actually at 2009 numbers. It's
Right.
10 years ago.
Well, and it's even more impressive than that, because obviously the levy mill rate is an impact of the assessed value. If you actually look at the levy, which
Yeah.
is on page...
Yeah, that
The
was...
levy's actually down.
Yeah,
So last year's levy was $26,167,252. This year's anticipated levy, including the debt service, at a level payment, is $26,122,171.
Yeah, then that was my next question, is that our levy, what we're seeking from our taxpayers includes both the 14 and the 16 referendums. The cost of that to the taxpayers is figured into that levy number.
Yes.
Okay, and then the fund balance number, taking out the carryover, if we remove that, we're still going to be above 20% or close to it?
Yeah, close to it, I think, is correct. I'll be doing more analysis on that in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, we're per our policy, but for purposes tonight, that's what I needed to know. I don't have any other questions. Anybody else with any questions? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the preliminary budget as presented so that that might be presented to the district electors at the annual meeting.
I move to approve the preliminary budget as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Barb, anything you want to say? Courtney?
No.
Troy? Dan?
Great job as usual. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Got a couple things to say in terms of, it's a lot of work to put this together. It's, I think, the first time we're like above 60 million now. I mean, we run a $60 million business here, and that's pretty, it was under 50 when I started way back when. You know, one of the things that we are hearing when we are talking about our referendum is recognizing that this is the third time we've gone out for a referendum in 5 years. And, you know, we're obviously very sensitive about the cost to taxpayers, particularly those on fixed income. And so I think it speaks well of us if we can talk about some of the fiscal data that we have that shows that we're really careful with how we spend our tax money, and that we're doing a really good job as a school district and as a taxing authority in that regard. So, for example, you know, we've seen data, and I've had Brian and Andy pull together data on how we match other districts in Dane County on per student expenditure basis, and the data that we've gotten from 15-16, because it trails behind a couple of years, is we're dead on average with all the Dane County districts in terms of per student expenditures. So that indicates, at least in a normative way, that we're right on target. I think the more telling number is the one that Annie just indicated. And Scott, I know you're listening there somewhere, and we'll be writing an article about this, but including the expenditures for both the last referendums, our levy, that is the amount we're asking our taxpayers to pay this year in this year's budget, has gone down. Okay? And that's reflected in a mill rate that is at least on historical data, back to 2009 levels. I mean, that's a pretty impressive job in terms of managing taxpayer monies. Our fund balance at the same time has stayed constant around 20%, 23%, which indicates that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. Another thing that I look at is, you know, we've taken the amount of money that we were supposed to calculate by accounting standards for our post-employment benefits. I remember when we first run that GASB calculation, we were like in 13 million and higher. We've now got that down to $3 million over a period of time, and continuing to prepay that down. Okay, if you saw the debt line there, is our debt levy will be low for a long period of time, and even if we approve the new referendum, we're going to be able to absorb $400,000 of taxpayer costs based on the way we've structured our debt over the last 10 years. So, you know, we have a good story to tell. Yes, indeed, you know, if we're going out for referendum and asking for additional taxpayer monies, that's a reality of it. But the fact of the matter is, this is a well-run district economically, and we should point out those good factors. So, excellent job. Would you call the roll?
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Mr. Pankratz?
Yes.
Mr. Zach?
Yes. Preliminary budget's approved on a 5-0 basis. That takes us to educator compensation, and we have a number of agreements to approve. And that's Gina's, right?
It is.
Okay, so you've got the floor.
Okay, so we will have to take this into 4 different parts, so I'm just going to go one at a time. Andy and I met with Laura Stoller and Nate Johnson to talk about the collective bargaining agreements for 2017-18 and then also 18-19 since we're at the start of the 2018 school year.
Can I interrupt you just for
Yes.
a second? Because Troy walked out,
Oh.
and we did that on purpose.
Oh,
And I
that's right.
forgot
I'm
to
sorry.
notice Troy's wife is an educator in the district, and so pursuant to our ethics code, he absents himself not only for the voting, but also for the discussion part. So Troy's out of the building right now. Oh, he
Okay.
might be in the building, but in a different
Thank
location.
you. And we will make
Sorry,
sure
Gina.
that-
Yeah,
no
I just-
problem.
Yeah.
We'll make sure the minutes reflect that as well. So in terms of the 2017-18 bargain, what we discussed with the OEA and what we offered is that we would offer the maximum allowed by law of the 1.26%, but that money would be used to fund the educator compensation plan that was approved in the referendum in November of 2016. If you look at all of the movement through this schedule, it's at least a 4 to 5% increase. So that money definitely went to fund the schedule, as well as some supplemental compensation that the voters approved in the referendum. So the OEA, we reached a tentative agreement with the OEA for 1.26% to fund the schedule, and they did ratify that on October 28th. So, I'm sorry, August, thank you, Courtney, August 28th. I'd like to say I was up late watching the Packers, but I was not. So in terms of what I would like the board to do is to vote to approve the 2017-18 collective bargaining agreement for the 1.26% to fund the schedule.
Okay, any questions of Gina on that? Okay, then I'd entertain a motion to that effect. That would be the 17-18 CBA with the OEA.
Yes.
To approve that. Is there a motion to that effect?
I move to approve the 1.26% increase as proposed, which would effectuate the agreement with the OEA.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Second, any discussion? Seeing none, could you call the roll?
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Mr. Zach?
Yes, and would you mark Mr. Pankratz as abstaining from the vote? Okay, number 2.
So then the question was asked as to what about those educators that are off the salary schedule? So for those educators that make more than $65,000 and really have since the model was implemented. And for that discussion, we had a meet and confer with the OEA, and I wanted to thank Barb Feeney and Tim LeBrun for joining us in that conversation. It was very helpful to have them present, and I appreciate that. What we talked about is that you will see in the plan that what we anticipated was having a $3,000 stipend, so that is supplemental compensation. It does not go into their base wages for the contract. It would be essentially what Andy would call a one-time payment. We had put that in the plan that educators would receive that after completing their pathway. And at the time we developed the plan, we were anticipating that our pathways would be 3 years. What we didn't anticipate is that educators would move through the pathways quickly, or that they weren't exactly a perfect 3-year track. And what we talked about was if we could take that $3,000 that we had earmarked for those stipends, and instead of paying them out at the end of 2018-19, that we could really pay educators along the way, assuming that they were making sufficient progress on their pathways and their professional development. So we made, as a committee, a decision that we would recommend to the board, and I should say as a committee, Ms. Feeney, Mr. LeBrun, Mr. Weiland, and myself, that we would recommend for 2017-18 that those educators off the schedule would receive a $1,000 stipend for 2017-18. And so I will ask for that motion in a moment, but I just wanted to give you the full picture that then what we also would ask the board is that for 18-19, what the big picture would look like is that they would receive an additional $1,000 stipend and then have a choice of an additional payment. So you can see if the educators choose the stipend for 17-18, 18-19, and then the additional stipend for 18-19, that we stay within that $3,000 that we had budgeted.
But it's just accelerating that payment up, assuming that they're on the pathway.
That's correct. And the other item that I should have anticipated but I didn't is that we did have 2 educators retire in 17-18 that did complete their pathways, but there's no provision for a payment for them. So that was another factor in the recommendation. So I would like to ask the board to approve for 17-18 a $1,000 stipend for those educators that are above the blue level, which is the $65,000 or the $61,000 level, depending on their degree.
Okay, is there a
Can
motion?
I have a question here? Is this then dependent on, this stipend dependent on somebody being within their scheduled improvement plan, or what do we call it?
Professional development pathway?
Right.
Yes, it's dependent upon them having successfully made progress on that.
Okay. I move that we approve the $1,000 stipend for educators who are above the salary schedule, and that would be dependent on their being in compliance with the expected pathways.
Got that? Is there a second? Barb with a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, could you call the roll, Katie?
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico?
Yes.
Mr. Zach?
Yes, and Mr. Pankratz abstains. Number 3.
So then going back to the collective bargaining agreement for the 18-19 school year, we did have bargaining sessions with the OEA, Mr. Weiland and myself, and what we offered and was accepted as a tentative agreement that we would offer the maximum amount allowed by law, the 2.13% for base wages, and we would use that money to fund the final year of implementation of the educator compensation plan. And the OEA did vote to approve that on August 28th.
So we need a motion to approve the tentative agreement as ratified by the OEA for 18-19. Is there a motion to that effect? Ms. Feeney with a motion, is there a second? Ms. Oderico with a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, Katie, could you call the roll?
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico?
Yes.
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Mr. Zach?
Yes, and Mr. Pankratz abstains. And finally,
Yes. So then we had a meet and confer with the OEA about how to address the educators that are again off schedule for the 18-19 school year. What we talked about is giving those educators a choice. So there would be 2 parts, that for the 18-19 school year, they would receive a $1,000 stipend, assuming that they had made sufficient progress or completed their pathway. And then they would receive an additional stipend in the amount of $850 or a $1,000 employer contribution into their 403B account. The reason that we looked at the 403B account is that there were listening sessions with some of the educators, and the OEA expressed that some of the educators were intrigued by a payment into the 403B plan. That was intriguing to us as well, because one of our goals is to really increase the financial literacy of our staff, and we would like to increase the participation in our 403B account, because we're really seeing a need for folks to do some better planning in their retirement. And so we wanted to give an incentive for folks to select that choice. Additionally, when we do that contribution into the 403B plan, we do not pay WRS or FICA on that, where we do pay that on the stipend. So that's an additional 15% cost on the $850. So that makes those more equivalent from a financial level. So we would look for the board to approve that recommendation from our committee.
any questions?
Yeah, thanks. Gina, I know we've talked about this before, but can you remind me how many educators we're talking about?
We have about 30. We had a couple retire.
So I need a motion to approve the expenditures for the stipends and 18-19, $1,000, and then a choice of the $850 to the, or $1,000 to the 403B as recommended. Which is really, Gina, just an acceleration of what the plan had. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
I move to approve the 2018-19 $1,000 stipend plus another $850 stipend or a $1,000 employer contribution to the educator's 403B account for our employees, our educators who are above the salary scale.
Great. Got a motion and a second. Do we have a second? Barb with a second. Any further questions or discussion? Seeing none, could you call the roll?
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico?
Yes.
Mr. Zach?
Yes. And Mr. Pankratz with an abstention. We're done, right?
Yes,
And
thank you very
it's
much.
good. Two thanks. Thanks, Nathan, for your patience and work with us on that. And Barb, thank you for meeting. And I've thanked him. We talked about that because he wasn't going to be here, so I expressed my thanks to him. Gina, Brian, and I met, and we talked about continuing our conversations about the group of teachers that are above the salary schedule right now. At our leaders meeting that Brian and I had with the OEA last week, we talked about this, and we're going to have continuing conversations, Nathan, with you folks about how to address that level of employee in our district. So it's not the end of our conversation. There are a number of ways that we can address that, but we know it's something as we evolve in our plan that we have to take a look at seriously. So, and if somebody wants to go roust up Troy, we can bring him back into the meeting. Because we now go to committee reports, and Krista's not here to talk about policy, but visioning. Courtney, anything to report?
Yes, so the Vision Steering Committee met on August 21st, and at that meeting there was one thing on the agenda, which was a report from the Youth Sports and Athletics Task Force. So we heard from several members of that task force about the work that they had done over the last year in meeting with community leaders and staff, faculty, administrators, and all sorts of folks who have an interest in fleshing out a new philosophy, I guess is a way I would put it, for youth sports in our community. And they had sort of a three-pronged recommendation. And I don't want to give it away because they're going to come and do another report to the full board. So I don't think I'll get into the detail of what their recommendation was, but it was a very good report, and I was very excited by the level of engagement, not just of the folks at the meeting, but at what they expressed. Other folks in the community, other youth sports leaders and participants really were equally engaged. So I think we've got some interesting things to hear about from them.
And interest not only in this community about what we're doing, but other school districts
Right.
are looking at what we're doing and saying, wow, what are you guys doing?
Right.
Yeah, how are you doing that?
Right. So I think the plan is to have them come to our first meeting in October. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I don't know that their whole task force will come. It may be an abbreviated version of their task force, but they will give us the same presentation that they gave us at the Vision Steering Committee meeting.
Great.
And I think at that point they'll look for us to respond to that report and perhaps offer some guidance as to next steps, because they do have three very specific recommendations that they will be making to the board.
Great.
So.
Any questions of Courtney about that? It was an excellent report.
It was a very
Thank
good
you.
report.
And Mike, thank you. Mike Carr, thanks for that. You and Krista did an excellent job, and I look forward to hearing the presentation to the full board and then taking those recommendations out and implementing them. And we're going to put us on the forefront of philosophy in terms of moving forward.
It's exciting. I hope
I
we
think.
can build momentum.
Yeah.
And I will just add that I don't, at this point, have any plans for another meeting of the Vision Steering Committee anytime soon.
Okay.
My intention is to wait until referendum time.
I think that's
and then use the Vision Steering Committee to plan beyond that, depending on our outcome.
Yep.
Okay.
Good. Thanks. And Gina, by the way, thanks for your work on the educator compensation. You and Andy both. It's good to have that done, and we're done for 18-19 at the beginning of the year.
We are very grateful to have that plan.
Yep. That takes us to E2. By the way, Troy, we marked you as abstaining on the 4 votes that we took related to the educator compensation and explained why you were leaving. So, yep. Leslie, you're going to talk to us about the professional development pathways. Having referenced educator compensation, this is a component of that, and so the floor is yours.
Yes, that too. I forgot about that. But I'll also need the HDMI. I think you've got it in yours. And if we just pull it over to mine. Well, there is a lot to talk about, so I could entertain you for a while. Thank you. When Steve mentioned that people are interested in what it is we're doing, I think the same thing applies for what it is we're doing related to these professional learning pathways, because it is a rather unique approach. And in June of June 30th, 2018 is when we really concluded our first full year. Because as you know, when the referendum passed in November of 2016, we really worked to put together as many quality professional development opportunities as we could to round out that year. And then we started the next school year, July 1st of 2017, with the pathways fully present. So as we go into year 2 related to these pathways, we are keeping them the same. As we know, these pathways are for at least 3 years, but honestly, I expect that these will continue beyond that, because there is certainly more than 3 years of important learning related to what we're doing right now. And what we're doing is really highly related to the values that we hold dear as a school district. So, as you may remember, we have highly effective practices as a pathway, educational equity, the new educator pathway, which is the pathway that everyone's on the first year they're with us, but it's a very differentiated pathway, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then anything related to our board priority of personalizing the learning experience or meeting the needs of the whole child. It doesn't matter what pathway you have selected. Those opportunities are open to you because we believe that they're fundamental to who we are and what we value. So first I'll walk you through each of the pathways and maybe some examples of some of the professional learning that were associated with them. And then I'll walk you through some of the pathways that people took in 17-18 so you can see how they used their time. Because people certainly did devote a lot of time to this. The highly effective practices pathway, when we did a report in my learning plan, which is how everybody keeps track of what they're doing and what pathway it's associated with. We had 15,000 learning hours from our staff related to highly effective practices. So this was the most popular pathway pick. And what we're focusing on are specifically 4 specific practices. It's not just about anything. It's about these 4 things. Teacher and student clarity through the use of learning targets, effective use of feedback, formative assessment to move teaching and learning forward, and student goal setting as part of the process to help them become assessment capable learners. So what are some of the things we've put together to help people learn along this pathway? Well, one example is a course that John Tanner and I facilitate, Foundations of Highly Effective Practices. We had a cohort last year. We're wrapping up a cohort now and starting a new cohort in October. And we've worked with our coaches so that in between this foundations class that we offer, our coaches are offering classes that are specific to each of the practices within the list. So it's really a big partnership with our coaches, and I think you'll see that throughout this. Another example is we have teachers who are involved in the with a UW math cohort for getting a certificate in math, in teaching math from the UW. We had one group complete the cohort that's action research oriented, and we have our second group nearing their third semester. That has been a really strong partnership, and it led to the action researchers from our district presenting at the state math conference. Another example would be a really excellent, happens to be another UW collaboration that's focusing in on the high school at the moment. AIW is Authentic Intellectual Work. So we have, starting this year, we had a small cohort last year working with Bruce King and Laura Lang from the UW. And now this year we have 4 interdisciplinary teams from the high school who are working together. And it's really about creating highly authentic tasks, rigorous and authentic tasks for students using a rubric that was developed through the UW to be able to assess the learning task in which the students are engaging. And the fact that it's interdisciplinary is another really awesome twist, because you have people from all across this very large quarter-mile building who are now working on small teams together to examine the work that each of them is putting in front of a student against this rubric for what does make it authentic and rigorous. So those are 3 examples of exciting things that people are participating in related to this particular pathway. But with 15,000 hours, you can certainly make the assumption that it was more than that, because it was. The next pathway that people spent a lot of time in is educational equity. As a matter of fact, I think it was 7,600 hours, something close to that. Some great examples of the learning that people engaged in related to this, the Critical Consciousness Institutes that we held. We've held 2 cohorts, and then this summer we held one called Beyond Critical Consciousness, where those cohorts were invited back for another 2 days. They're facilitated by some excellent facilitators who are district-level administrators in the Middleton Cross Plains School District. And so the teachers spent Friday night and Saturday here in this room for 2 weekends last winter and in the spring. And it was a well-received, well-reviewed professional learning experience that really gave people the energy to continue to dig into this and reflect, and it made a very positive impact on people according to the feedback. And they're really anxious to get into, how do I make this something that is really meaningful for my students in my classroom? And we're using some really excellent texts to help people delve deeper into that. An example of delving deeper into that is teaching tolerance, the anti-bias standards. Amy Bintliff, who is a former OSD educator, has now facilitated several days of professional development for cohorts of teachers who want to take a look at the teaching and learning that's happening in their classroom and put it next to the anti-bias standards so they can bring those 2 things together. And it's resulted in some really great things. And it's also resulted in Amy coming back to coach interested people within their content area to help them continue the work over the course of the year, because none of the things that we are doing are one time and it's done. They're things that we're working to make it a collaborative, job embedded, long time effort. So it's not just something that people attend and they're done with it. We've also, this was a popular offering, which was the Equity Film Series. It was offered here at the high school. People registered and they came together to have a film experience related to a topic on equity, and then had discussion groups afterward. So I think a big benefit of a lot of our pathway work has been the cross-building collaboration that has resulted. because people are coming together from all of the buildings on topics that it doesn't make any difference whether you teach 2nd grade or 10th grade, because they're topics that are important to our students regardless of where they are on the developmental continuum. And like I said, that was about 7,000 some hours that people spent on that. And it was really well aligned to the professional learning that was happening during in-service days, as was effective practices. I think that's another outcome of the pathway system, is what people are learning on within these 5 days and these floating days is aligned to what they're learning in their in-service. So it's all about how things work together, right? And it's not about learning something separate that's not connected to what you're doing in the rest of your job. Our new educator pathway, like I said, it's for 1 year, and we're doing some really interesting things there too. The new educator orientation takes up about 24 hours of their 5 days and the additional floating day. But this year we're also offering a class called the Optimal Learning Environment for all educators new to the district. It's for 16 hours, facilitated by Colleen Christensen and Stacy Surgent, a Netherwood Knoll teacher. On the characteristics of an optimal learning environment, what we expect all of our students to be able to experience here in our school district. And it's really well aligned with our pathways. It's about creating equitable, inclusive classrooms, using effective strategies, developing strong relationships with students. I mean, it's all the things that we've been talking about already. So it works together really well. In addition, our teachers who are new to the district take part in at least 2 evening sessions offered by Dane County New Teacher Project. We think it's excellent because A, we really have a lot of confidence in their facilitators. They're fabulous. But the other thing is they get to talk with teachers from across Dane County about topics that are relevant to being new to education. And we feel really confident that when they're talking about their experiences elsewhere, they will feel very fortunate that they're in Dane County, and in particular that they're with us. And that's one of the things we said at New Educator Orientation, is we want this experience to validate your choice to be a part of our team. Whole child applies to anything, and people engaged in, I have to think now, I think it was 6,500 hours related to whole child. And that could be a lot of different things. And we have our own trainers in almost all of these things. Trauma sensitive schools, nurtured heart, the work of Ross Green and collaborative, proactive approaches to students who are really struggling. That is really taken off, and we have a certified trainer within our district who is not only embedding it within the job she has at her building, but is conducting pilots elsewhere. So, what does this look like for people who are actually doing it? I thought you might find this kind of interesting. So here's an example of an educator within our district who last year took a very focused approach. She decided that equity was her pathway, and she was going to be very focused on that. So she did the teaching tolerance experience with Amy Bintliff last summer. Then she engaged in the Critical Consciousness Institute. And then with colleagues within her building, she was in a book study on culturally responsive teaching in the brain, which is the book that every school is reading in order to help us understand how to really take what we're learning about equity and influence the students' learning experience with that work. This particular person told me that this was the best year of professional learning she's had in her career, and she's been in the game about as long as I have, so that says something. And what was important to her is she felt like really digging deep into one thing that mattered made a difference in how productive she felt with her own learning. Now, this person took a much wider focus. This person had highly effective practices, and it's really important to note that no matter what your pathway, part of your professional learning can be content specific, because we want people to continue to cultivate their content knowledge also. That's a really important part of learning. So this particular person had 3 one-day workshops spread out over the course of the year, specific to her content. And then she engaged in the highly effective practices class for an additional 16 hours. And then because she saw that even though things were really productive, good things were happening within her classroom, there were still a couple of students that she felt she needed more tools in the toolbox to do the best job possible for them related to choices they were making in the class. So she engaged in a book study related to the work of Ross Greene. So that's an example of meeting the needs of the whole child while also focusing on content and practices. This one I thought was a great example because it really highlights the role of our coaches and the relationship between our teachers and our coaches. This person was in highly effective practices as their pathway. And some of our coaches got together and we're using a program called Newsella, which is a service that provides news articles for students, but they take a specific topic and they make the news article match the reading level of the student. So that way all the students can read about a specific topic even if their reading levels aren't exactly the same, and they can get just as much out of it. So the coaches developed a training for this, but within that training, they were infusing things that they had already learned about the importance of equitable practices, about the importance of feedback and learning targets. And so that was for 8 hours, and that was an experience that was across RCI and OMS. But then this particular person, she and her team wanted to work with the coaches for an additional 8 hours to hone in on that subject. So they created their own study group facilitated by their coach for that. And then this person was in, she happens to be a math teacher also. So she was in the Visible Learning for Mathematics, one of our John Hattie books. She was in that facilitated by our coaches for 8 hours with people from across the entire district, K-12. And then she and her team worked with the math coach to create a team-specific independent study on implementing what they learned in that book. She also took the feedback for learning class, which was offered by our coaches, and was in the notice and notebook study offered by our coaches. The next person did equity plus content, and I hope you're noticing that pathways blend. That was the focus. That was intentional. I now have people saying to me, well, my focus is effective practices, but I'm doing this on equity because I can hardly tell the difference anymore. They're both so important and they feed off each other. And that's true. So this person took a Witnessing Whiteness class, which was a book study throughout Madison, did a content workshop, an equity film series, a webinar, and the book study on culturally responsive teaching. So those are just some examples of how what you're hearing about is living out for the teachers and how they are working to embed that into the student experience. So it's not just next year, isn't just a continuation of the pathways, it's more of a continuation of this whole philosophy, right? That we have areas of focus as a district, things that we believe to be important to the learning of our students. However, within those pathways, people can personalize their approach. While the vast majority of people have been within either effective practices or equity, there's a small handful of people who've chosen a pathway of their own creation, but it's still highly connected to those things. We are growing our internal capacity, but at the same time, we're developing partnerships because those partnerships are really important. And we're at about 50% of our learning, our professional learning, is being facilitated by our own staff members at this point. We're promoting it to be collaborative, job embedded, and ongoing. We're creating this culture of inquiry where people are saying, you know what, I really want to know more about this. And so my colleagues and I want to study this within the framework of our pathway. And they're developing their own learning experiences and then using time to collaborate on how to make that impactful on our students. And that our pathways are blending because they're interconnected. It's really, you can't really, once you learn enough about one, then you see the connection to the other. So you can tell I'm enthusiastic. And now I'm also open for questions.
Dan.
Great work. I really love the way that you've developed these pathways, and I don't have any particular questions.
Troy, anything?
No questions. Great work, Leslie.
Courtney, anything? Barb?
I was just going to ask, so since a lot of the teaching is being done by our staff, those are all happening on days that have been set aside for professional development?
No, because that's already contract time. So it's happening evenings, weekends, summers. So what we're really doing quite a bit of is developing online learning opportunities that also have face-to-face components so that people can work it around their lifestyle and what works well for them. It's been very helpful. And John and I have been investigating new learning platforms because what we've found out is as useful as Google Classroom is for online collaboration, it's very difficult to have a collegial conversation through that platform. So now we're investigating some other possibilities to put our courses on there.
So the professional development days are being used for other kinds of...
But related. So for instance, during our in-service days, every school has in-service related to equity and things that we're learning along that journey. And every school has in-service related to either feedback or learning targets or the use of formative assessment, etc. And whole child, particularly with our safety grants, we'll be taking a really strong look at how many people are already trained in trauma-sensitive schools and how many people still need the training. And, you know, we're taking a really, a very proactive approach to working with our students who have experienced trauma and or have mental health challenges, including our new social emotional learning coaches, but that's a whole other presentation.
Couple questions, Leslie. Tell us about how the plans are developed and who oversees them and what's the process of putting them together?
People use their professional, well, as part of our educator effectiveness system, you have to have a student learning objective every year, and you have to have a professional practice goal every year. We have changed the forms within our professional practice goal to be able to ask teachers to record their pathway and how their pathway is connected to the needs of their student and how their learning is impacting the learning of their students. So we're using that part of the educator effectiveness process to record what pathway people have chosen. After that, people are able to look at the district catalog with all the learning opportunities that are offered, and there are also forms for them to propose the facilitation or propose attendance at a conference, etc. But they look at what's being offered, and within that write-up, it says what pathway it's connected to. So they can right away go in and see, oh, all of these things are for effective practices, these things are for equity, etc. When they click Sign Me Up, an approval form goes to their principal. After their principal approves it, it goes to me. So there's a double layer of approval for most things within the system. And that means that it's really important that the principals and the district office people have similar ideas for what should and should not be approved. So we've had discussions related to that.
There was a really good article in the Oregon Observer about the educator compensation plan and the impact in recruiting and retention that that plan has had just based on the dollar amounts of compensation. But the second leg of that was the professional development aspect of that, which is this. How do you feel about that? We've had a lot of conversation over 4 or 5 years about how we ought to frame the accountability piece of that for, you know, from the taxpayer standpoint, like be real easy to assign it on ACT scores, you know, and make it simple and letter grade, but we chose a much more difficult path that we thought was more effective. Tell us how you view our choice in that regard in terms of the accountability piece.
Well, I think what we all know and what researchers certainly told us is that the most important factor in a student's achievement, whether it's academic or social emotional, is the quality of the teacher in the classroom. And you need to be able to invest into the learning of the teachers in the classroom in order to ensure that our students are getting the experience they want. So philosophically, I think that we made the exact right choice with what we did. And as far as accountability goes, educators are natural learners, and it's more of an issue where we have to tell people you've used all of your days as opposed to you need to sign up and register for something. People are eager and they like to be able to have control over what they do and when they do it. Consequently, there haven't been accountability issues because people have choice within the parameters of what we're focusing on as a district. So we made the philosophical choice, I think the correct one, I think, when we talked about how it is that we hold us all accountable for student achievement. We chose to invest in the learning of our professionals, and our professionals have been amazing. They have taken control of their learning, and they're basing it off the needs of their students. And it's pretty remarkable to hear. And for instance, at the Authentic Intellectual Work class, which was on August 30th, so a lot of the teachers weren't involved, but there's 30 some who are, and they were in the room next door. Well, maybe it was 25 because that's a little small for 30. And they were talking about why they were doing it. And their whys were all about the needs of their students and wanting to be better for their students. It was inspirational. And after new educator, the back to school presentation, when we had all of the teachers who were out in front of their hundreds of colleagues talking about why they wanted to be a part of Oregon, that was a high, because people spoke about all the things that we think are important, all the things that all of us collectively think are important, with no prompting, with no please use this term, please say this, please say that. They weren't given any prompting. It was all people, and we could have picked anybody from the audience who would have been able to come down and talk about why they do what they do and what's important, because we're on the same page about it. So I think we made a very fine choice as far as how it's going to impact our students.
From where I sit, it's the first time I've heard, that we've had professional development that's systemic and purposeful and teacher-driven.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really good to hear. It'll be a good message to send out to the community that the plan that we chose and the monies that they're spending for the plan are really paying off in terms of increasing our learning in the district.
Mm-hmm.
So,
absolutely.
how do you feel about how we're doing?
There's always room for improvement. I want it to get better all the time. I want to continue to listen to people, to make people a part of the most important part of the process, to empower people. All of those things are what makes this work. So where we are right now, it's good, but a year from now, it's going to be better. And hopefully I'll say that for forevermore.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That takes us to informational items. F, 2018 referendum informational update. Brian, that's yours. I don't know if you wanted me to give that to Barb or what. And Brian, is Erica going to lead this?
Yes, Erica is going to get us started, and then I'll have a couple of comments.
Great. Floor is yours, Erica.
Okay, so you should all have in front of you, I believe, the referendum communication update, and I will just walk through it. And then also this map that hopefully came around, and then I am open to questions after that. So this is an update on recent activity, and recent means since the previous board meeting. So Brian mentioned at the last meeting that we were filming a video. The video is finished. Thank you to OCAmedia for the hard work on that, and it is on our website for people to view. We have finalized the informational sheet, and we call it sheet number 2 because it's the second one. It's distributed to all district buildings. And if you've walked in the front of all district buildings, you'll also see that informational sheet sits within a display board that is prominent in each building. We have distributed information at back to school events. That's where I was a little late today. That's where Brian and I were at the middle school for their back to school event, but we have all of those events on our calendars and are continuing to go to those. We did some informational presentations, a couple noted here, the Oregon Chamber, and then also the Boy Scouts invited us to talk about the referendum. Andy and I joined them for that. Last week, you may have noticed an editorial by Dr. Bussler in the Oregon Observer. And we also created a district boundary map that is also on our website, and that's the other piece that you have in front of you. In terms of next steps, this coming week, you will see an ad in the Observer promoting the community open house sessions that we are going to be having. It'll also be in the Fitchburg Star. And our first open house is coming up next Monday on September 17th. We're continuing to work on the FAQs. We'll be continuing to add to those as we come upon information. And again, continuing to attend back to school events and share information there, answer questions, as well as with community groups and presentations. Always updating the website whenever we have new information. And about to finalize a piece real soon. It's a newsletter that will be sent to all households within the district. So those are the brief updates I have. What questions do you have for me?
Anybody? Courtney?
Erica, you mentioned that this district boundary map is going to be posted on the website. Is there any other plan for this in particular? Because I think this is a very important piece of information that the more widely distributed, the more effective it will be.
It is a very important piece of information, and it's something, was one of the observations from our focus groups also, if you recall, that people just don't know what our district looks like, because why would you study that other than, right? So yes, it is on the mailing that will be sent out very soon, so it's a part of that piece, and we'll certainly distribute it wherever else we can. Mm-hmm.
The one thing that to consider maybe putting on here is the number of students already that attend the Oregon School District from Fitchburg. I mean, if we're looking at that, and as one of the fastest growing, I think that's a misconception out there, is that people don't realize how many students we already educate from Fitchburg area.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Mm-hmm.
We just created this district boundary map and total tax base over the weekend, so we're printing it on our own, so we're printing it right here. If there's something that you've heard that we can include as a district fact, just let us know and we will continue to update it. Our plan is also to bring this to presentations and distribute it just like an informational sheet. And then the last item that was set at your table is a summary of the communication calendar. And just really quickly, any date that is underlined has already occurred. So we are down to, after tonight's board meeting, item number 20, which was the September 10th board meeting. And then we have so far items 21 through 54 through November 1st. And then the last page is a summary of items that Erica and I are still in the process of collaborating and getting some meetings set. I will share something that was new that came up last week. Jeremy Crosby from the Fitchburg Access Community TV gave me a call and was interested in doing a back-to-school interview along with a referendum interview. So he came in and taped a session with me on Friday morning. So while I don't have access to Fitchburg Access TV, I know someone that does. So Courtney, you can check it out for us. He also told me he would provide us with a clip that we could put on our website. So lots of things are going on, and if at any time you have some open or available time, just let us know. There are never too many of us handing out information at any of these upcoming activities, and a particularly challenging night for us is Thursday, September 27th, where we have 3 back-to-school nights. We have at least one administrator at each of these events, but board members, if you have any flexibility in your schedule, that's just a night where we're all spread a little thin and we would love to have you join us if possible. So we will continue to update this. I forgot to give this to Katie on Friday, and that's why you didn't get it in the weekly update, and you ended up getting an email from me over the weekend, so I didn't forget to do it on Monday. So this is where we're at, and we'll continue to work diligently between now and November 6th.
What are high school conferences? I'm looking at that. There it is, in the 9th.
Yes. Jim, 9th and the 11th?
Okay. Those are always, the parent-teacher
Yes.
conferences and the back-to-school nights are nights when it would be helpful to have board members. So I'll be emailing you guys to see if we can't get folks there. Okay. Anything else, Brian or Erica?
No, that's...
Thanks for getting facts out for us. Superintendent's report, Brian.
I have a couple of items tonight. First, the opening of the school year. Our preliminary enrollment estimates have us just over 4,100 students. So it's fair to say that our enrollment is trending up from where we closed last year's school district. I had the opportunity to visit every school, some schools a couple of times last week, and of course, as you would imagine, the first week of school is busy and exciting, and everyone is super happy to be back. And oftentimes parents say, "Thank you. We are so delighted you are back in session." So I had the opportunity to speak with a lot of parents and a lot of students, and it was just a great first week of school. Secondly, the success of the educator compensation plan, whether you heard the financial information, which is certainly an important part in terms of the compensation plan that we received the additional community support for, and how Gina and Andy have made that a reality for our school faculty has been fantastic. And then we were super excited to have the opportunity that Leslie had to talk about professional development and pathways. And if you think back to where we started with that plan, there were two things we were really after. Attracting great staff, retaining great staff, and also continuing that focus of ongoing continuous improvement. And our staff, as Leslie mentioned, they love to learn, and they are great, great learners, and that really helps support our plan. So I trust you walk away from tonight's report on our education compensation plan knowing that we hit the mark, and it has been a big success, and we're not going to rest on that success. We're going to continue that success in the years ahead. Obviously, this is a super busy time of the year with all of the back-to-school activities. Shannon had a wonderful back-to-school night tonight over at the middle school, and there was something that I've never seen before at a public school, which was great. We had 4 food carts, and it was an opportunity for parents and students to enjoy some food prior to the back-to-school event, which was very cool. It smelled delicious. We were handing out materials outside. Erica and I decided we're going to catch people while they're outside. So again, we had an opportunity to visit with a number of parents and community members and students about our growth. Another thing that's happening is our design team, which Leslie, Andy, and Carrie are chairing. They have been working diligently. They've gone on a number of school tours during the month of August. It's hard to believe August is actually over. Now we're halfway through September, how quickly it all goes. But the design team is doing some work, and you heard Andy reference the fact that we're going to have some expenses related working with Bray Architects and Findorf to make sure that when the referendum passes, we are poised to get that building designed so we can open it in time for the fall of 2020. Because the one thing we know with our enrollment trend, additional students are coming to school, and every day is almost precious in terms of us getting prepared for them. Steve asked me the question when I came back from the middle school today, did you take Perry Parkway? No, I forgot. And he said, old habits die hard. They do. I'm going to drive Perry Parkway on the way home tonight, but I totally forgot about it. But I did have the opportunity to attend the ribbon cutting today, and The village is obviously very happy that this project has come to fruition. As Jeff Rao was talking about it, he remarked that this project has been in the works for 25 years. And I was amazed to hear that the project had gone for 25 years. So
They were talking about that back in the 70s when I was in high school. So
perhaps a little more than 25 years.
yeah.
Another point that you noticed, and I'll just quickly highlight it, the economic well-being of the district is what supports our instructional delivery process. And as you looked at tonight's budget, you can see that the economic well-being of the district is in fantastic shape. And I don't take that for granted for a minute, because there are districts across the state that are struggling in ways that we've never experienced with their finances. We've been in a district where our finances have been well taken care of. Our economics, our local economics have been positive. We are able to survive and thrive in this budget environment and the reductions that we receive from the state. And I think it's something that we need to reflect on periodically, to know that we are a very fortunate district to be in the economic state that we're in. The tax levy impact, last two items, the tax levy impact of the November 6th referendum will likely decrease compared to what Michelle Weiberg has shared with us so far. You saw Andy's equalized valuation is higher. It's a projection that's more aggressive than what Michelle put together. Remember, Michelle put these projections together for us in early June, early July, and we continue to trend with some better information. So that should be good news to taxpayers as they look and consider and study our November 6th referendum proposal. We should receive new equalized values from the Department of Revenue here in early October, and as soon as we get that information, Andy's going to be sharing that information with all of you and working with Erica to get that posted on our website, and of course we'll be using that information as we move forward with the referendum. And of course it's always better to have the news getting better than for us to have to go back and say the news is worse as we zero in on the referendum. And then lastly, something that all of you should be proud of, I'm particularly proud of, and I know it's important to all of you just as it's important to me. We started the school year with a settled contract for our teachers, and that is super important. Successful school districts take care of their employees, and we have been able to do that with the help of our educator compensation plan, and I know that's important to you, and it's important to me, and it's certainly important to our school staff. So we are delighted to be off and running in the second week of school, and I'm guessing we're going to be off and running until that magic date when our high school seniors meet us on the stage and we graduate the class of 2019. So with that, I will stop and see if you have any questions for me.
Nice report, Brian. Thank you. A lot of good things happening. Future agenda. Our next meeting is the 24th, and we have the annual meeting. Were we planning on anything in addition to that?
We have typically, the last couple of years, not held a regular board meeting after the annual board meeting, and we checked at ABC and J today, and there wasn't anything that was pressing, so we didn't bring an agenda. But if something comes up, I'll be in touch with Steve, or if you board members see something that comes up, you can let Steve know, and we can work on a small agenda for that evening too.
Yep, I know Krista has a policy committee meeting on the 24th. So you're going to be working on the recommendation regarding the drug sniff, and that's probably going to come to us in that first meeting in October, I think, maybe the second meeting. Yeah, we just want to make sure everybody's here for that, and we're going to get the Youth Sports Task Force report in that first meeting. So.
And Steve, if I could go back, I did forget to mention, one of the things the board had asked us administratively to work on a bit earlier than we have in the previous years is the school calendar. So Gina, you may have launched the survey, or you're about to launch the survey?
We're going to talk at 18 tomorrow, and then we will launch it after
Okay, so our plan is to bring back a recommendation to the board at the October 10th, October 8th board meeting. I was looking at the wrong month. So we are 2-4, we're 4 weeks out for that, but that'll give us an opportunity to have the school calendar set almost 2 months earlier than we've set it in the last couple of years. Thank you for that one addition.
Any questions about that? And as usual, if you have anything you'd like to have placed on the agenda, let me or Brian know, and we'll move forward. Checkout before we go into closed session. We're going to go to closed session over in the room there, so we'll take about a 5-minute recess when we're done with checkout. But anybody have anything to check out? Courtney? Troy? Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple words. Tomorrow is September 11th. It's the 17th anniversary of attacks on our country, and I just was thinking that most of our students in this district, in fact, probably none of the students that are in our district remember that particular day. Some of them may have been born, but not old enough to remember that day, which ushered in an era which continues, an era of war, which a lot of us did not really grow up in. Though the Vietnam War was something that was winding down in the background when I was a child, we had relative peace throughout most of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, with the exception of the 2-month military excursion into the liberation of Kuwait, without an occupation force after that. And the 16 or so years of war that we've had since September 11th has really shaped our students. It's important to remember that many of our students that have graduated from Oregon, including Mark Miller's son, Nick, I can't remember his mother's name, Mark and Amy's son Nick is now a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army after graduating from West Point Military Academy in May of this year. Just one of our distinguished graduates. One of the paths that many graduates consider as military, although I think it's fairly rare, but it's an honorable path. It's one that I followed for a few years, and it's sometimes even my inclination to shy away from flag waving, patriotism for patriotism's sake. I think it's important to remember this anniversary and the things that have happened in our lives of our students because of the events on September 11th, 2001. That's all.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's hard to believe that our seniors probably were born that same year. It seems like just yesterday watching that horrific event occur. Thanks. I just we talked a little bit about equity and in Leslie's presentation. I shared with you a while ago that I read a book on racism in America, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. I just read another book called Sing Unburied Sing. Shannon, you read that too. Then we had conversation. It won the National Book Award. The author's Jesmyn Ward. If you want to read a really amazing book, a really terrific perspective on racism in America as it is today, that's a terrific book on that. She's a great young writer, in her 20s, and she's won 2 National Book Awards in 4 years. So it's a terrific book. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then the board will be going into closed session and will not be returning to open session.